the smell hit me first. Not the cordite and burning promethium that had filled my nostrils during the battle, but something else entirely. A mixture of crude oil, unwashed flesh, and the metallic tang of fresh blood that seemed to permeate everything in this alien hell. When consciousness returned to my battered body, that smell told me everything I needed to know about where I was and what had happened to me. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Varys Kellyan of the 15th Cadian Shock Troops. I had commanded men in 17 major engagements across the Segmentum Solar, earning commendations for tactical excellence and personal courage under fire. My regiment had a reputation for never yielding ground to the enemy, never abandoning our positions, never leaving our fallen behind. I had served the Emperor faithfully for 23 years, rising through the ranks from a fresh-faced lieutenant to a seasoned commander whose tactical acumen had saved thousands of Imperial lives across a dozen worlds. But the Orks don't care about reputations. The invasion of Kelos Prime had been swift and brutal, even by greenskin standards. The warnings had come too late. Fragmentary Vox transmissions about massive space hulks appearing at the system's edge, panicked reports of drop pods raining down like meteors across the primary continent. By the time we understood the scale of the assault, the Orks had already established beachheads in 3 major population centers and were advancing inland with the inexorable momentum of a natural disaster. The intelligence reports had been catastrophically wrong. What our analysts had predicted would be a minor raid by feral Ork clans turned out to be a full-scale Wah, led by a war boss whose strategic cunning was matched only by his incredible savagery. They had been planning this assault for months, possibly years, gathering forces from across the sector while Imperial intelligence remained focused on more obvious threats. I was leading a counterattack against their main staging area when everything went wrong. My regiment had been tasked with disrupting Ork supply lines while the main Imperial force prepared for a decisive engagement near the planetary capital. It should have been a textbook operation: rapid insertion, targeted destruction of key infrastructure, and immediate extraction before enemy reinforcements could respond. What our intelligence had identified as a minor forward position turned out to be the center of a Wah that stretched across half the continent. We walked into an ambush that had been hours in the making, surrounded by greenskins who had been waiting for exactly this kind of overconfident Imperial response. The Orks had learned from previous encounters with human forces, adapting their tactics to exploit our predictable operational patterns. The battle began at dawn with what appeared to be a routine advance through territory that should have been lightly defended. My companies moved in standard formation, maintaining proper intervals and communication protocols as we approached the target zone. The first indication that something was wrong came from the forward scouts, who reported unusually sophisticated defensive positions that didn't match the crude fortifications typically associated with Ork forces. Then the trap was sprung with devastating efficiency. Concealed artillery positions opened fire from multiple directions, turning our advance into a killing field where movement in any direction brought death. The Orks had studied human tactical doctrine well enough to predict our responses to different types of attacks, positioning their forces to counter every standard maneuver we might attempt. The battle lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of desperate fighting as my regiment was systematically torn apart by enemies who treated warfare as the ultimate entertainment. I watched good soldiers die in ways that violated every convention of civilized combat, saw Imperial equipment turned into crude trophies, witnessed acts of violence that seemed motivated not by strategic necessity, but by simple, bloodthirsty joy. Captain Morven of 2nd Company was caught in a crossfire that should have killed him instantly, but the Orks deliberately aimed to wound rather than kill, keeping him alive to provide ongoing entertainment as they closed in for hand-to-hand combat. Sergeant Kellox managed to hold a vital choke point for over an hour, his heavy bolter cutting down dozens of attackers before a crude Ork rocket launcher turned his position into a crater that still contained pieces of his body. The Greenskins fought with a combination of savage fury and tactical intelligence that contradicted everything I had been taught about their species. They coordinated complex flanking maneuvers while maintaining the individual aggression that made each Ork warrior terrifying in close combat. Their equipment was crude but effective, their weapons unreliable but devastating when they functioned properly. Most disturbing was their obvious enjoyment of the carnage they were inflicting. Human soldiers fight out of duty, loyalty, or survival instinct. Orks fight because they love it, because violence is their natural state, because the act of killing and destroying brings them genuine pleasure. They weren't trying to defeat us so much as they were trying to maximize the entertainment value of our destruction. When the ammunition ran out and the position became untenable, I ordered the survivors to scatter and attempt individual escape. It was a coward's solution to an impossible situation, but command duty demanded that I preserve what remained of my force rather than sacrifice them in a futile last stand. Some of my men might have made it to the extraction zones. I would never know. The decision haunted me even as I made it. 23 years of military service had taught me that commanders who abandoned their men forfeited the right to lead, that the highest honor lay in dying alongside the soldiers under their command. But pragmatism demanded that I choose preservation over honor, that I send good men to their deaths while seeking my own survival. A massive Ork knob caught me as I tried to reach the communications bunker for a final transmission to regimental command. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, his crude power armor decorated with trophies taken from human soldiers he had killed in previous engagements. The skull of a Space Marine sergeant hung from his belt alongside the helmet of a commissar, and the severed hands of what might have been a dozen different Imperial officers. He moved with surprising speed for something that masked twice what an unaugmented human should be able to lift, his crude power claw crackling with unstable energy fields that left afterimages in my vision. I got off 3 shots with my bolt pistol before he was close enough to swat the weapon from my hand like a child's toy, the explosive rounds leaving shallow craters in his armor without significantly slowing his advance. The blow that put me down came from the flat of his chainsword, a mercy by Ork standards, since he could have easily bisected me with the same strike. The impact drove me to the ground with enough force to crack several ribs and fill my mouth with blood, but it left me conscious enough to hear his bellowing laughter as other greenskins converged on my position. They spoke in their guttural language, words that sounded like celebration mixed with anticipation. The knob who had captured me seemed particularly pleased with his prize, examining my rank insignia and equipment with the interest of a collector acquiring a rare specimen. The last thing I saw before unconsciousness claimed me was dozens of green faces leering down at me, their eyes bright with the kind of enthusiasm that promised I would regret surviving. I woke up in what the Orks called their scrapyards, though the term hardly did justice to the industrial nightmare that sprawled across several square kilometers of what had once been Kelos Prime's capital city. Crude shelters built from salvaged vehicle parts housed thousands of greenskins, while massive workshops produced the weapons and vehicles that kept their war machine operational. The entire complex throbbed with mechanical activity, a living organism of metal and flesh, dedicated entirely to the pursuit of warfare. The architecture followed no human logic, structures rising and falling according to principles that seemed to change from day to day as different orc clans competed for territory and resources. Buildings were constructed from whatever materials were available. Imperial vehicle hulks welded together, pieces of starship hull plating bent into shelter configurations, concrete barriers stacked into towers that defied every principle of structural engineering. Everything was loud, the constant hammering of metal on metal as weapons were forged and repaired. The roar of engines being tested and retested by mech boys whose understanding of mechanical principles was more intuitive than technical. The bellowing of orcs communicating with each other at volumes that would have been considered shouting in human society. There was no quiet, no rest, no moment when the cacophony subsided into something approaching peace. Sound was a weapon here, used to disorient and exhaust any non-orc forced to endure it. The noise had a psychological component that went beyond simple discomfort. It was designed to prevent contemplation, to make quiet reflection impossible, to ensure that prisoners could never find the mental space needed to plan escapes or maintain morale. Every moment of potential peace was shattered by mechanical roars, explosive tests, or simply the ambient sound of thousands of orcs going about their daily business of preparation for war. They had chained me to a post in what appeared to be a central gathering area, using restraints that had obviously been fashioned from Imperial Guard equipment. My own regulation boots had been turned into part of the binding system, while strips of flak armor from fallen comrades formed additional links in the crude but effective chain system. The irony was intentional. I was being held captive by the very equipment that had once protected me, transformed into instruments of my imprisonment by alien engineering that understood the psychological impact of such symbolic reversals. The other prisoners were a mixture of Imperial Guard, planetary defense forces, and civilians who had been unlucky enough to be captured alive rather than killed outright. Most showed signs of rough handling, bruises, cuts, and the kind of injuries that came from being treated as objects rather than people. But they were alive, which in Orc society indicated they had some value beyond immediate slaughter. That value, I learned, was entertainment. Among my fellow captives was Major Castris of the Valhallan Ice Warriors, a veteran officer whose regiment had been destroyed in the opening hours of the invasion. His left arm hung useless at his side, broken in multiple places during his capture, but left untreated by captors who showed no interest in the medical needs of their prisoners. Despite his injuries, he maintained the rigid military bearing that marked him as career soldier, though his eyes held the haunted look of someone who had seen his life's work reduced to meaningless destruction. Sergeant Corvus from the local planetary defense forces had been captured while defending a civilian evacuation point. His uniform was torn and blood-stained, bearing witness to a last stand that had probably saved hundreds of non-combatants at the cost of his freedom. He spoke little, spending most of his time staring at nothing with the 1,000-yard stare of someone whose mind had retreated from a reality too terrible to process fully. There was Corporal Venna of the 23rd Mordian Iron Guard, a young woman whose precise military bearing had been ground down by weeks of captivity into something resembling nervous compliance. She had been part of a reconnaissance unit that had stumbled into an Orc patrol, the sole survivor of an encounter that had claimed the lives of 8 highly trained specialists in a matter of minutes. The civilian prisoners were in many ways worse off than the military captives. They lacked the psychological conditioning that helped soldiers cope with extreme stress, the training that provided mental frameworks for dealing with violence and captivity. A merchant named Corin had been taken during the initial assault on Kelos City. his family killed before his eyes while he was spared for reasons known only to his captors. He spent most of his time weeping quietly, broken by losses that no amount of military stoicism could have prepared him to handle. Each prisoner had their own story of defeat and capture, but the details mattered less than the common reality we now shared. We were no longer soldiers of the Imperium or citizens of its worlds, but property of the Orks, kept alive only as long as we remained useful or entertaining. Our past accomplishments, our training, our dedication to the Emperor's service, none of it had any relevance to our current situation. Orks don't take prisoners for information or strategic advantage. They capture humans for the same reason they capture interesting rocks or unusual pieces of scrap metal, because they find us amusing and potentially useful for projects that haven't been fully defined yet. We were toys in the hands of creatures whose idea of play involved levels of violence that would horrify civilized beings. The first game I witnessed involved forcing prisoners to fight each other using improvised weapons, while Orks gathered to watch and place bets on the outcome. The arena was nothing more than a cleared circle surrounded by crude seating, but it served its purpose as a venue for entertainment that combined violence with the gambling that Orks seemed to enjoy almost as much as fighting itself. The losers weren't killed. That would have ended the entertainment too quickly, but they were injured in ways that would provide ongoing amusement for their captors. Broken bones that healed incorrectly, scars that served as permanent reminders of defeat, psychological wounds that made future performance even more entertaining as prisoners struggled with the trauma of previous encounters. I watched a planetary defense trooper named Kelligan forced to duel a terrified civilian using clubs made from vehicle parts. Neither man wanted to fight, but the alternative was immediate death for both. So they engaged in a half-hearted combat that delighted their audience despite its obvious reluctance. The Orks cheered every blow, roared approval when blood was drawn, and demanded more aggressive action when the combatants tried to minimize damage to each other. The psychological impact was worse than the physical violence. These weren't soldiers dying honorably in combat, but human beings reduced to performing for the amusement of alien savages. Every blow exchanged between prisoners was a victory for our captors, proof that they could force us to abandon our humanity for their entertainment. But the real genius of the system was its unpredictability. Prisoners never knew when they might be selected for the fighting pit, what opponent they might face, or what weapons would be provided. The uncertainty created constant anxiety that was almost as debilitating as the actual violence, ensuring that every prisoner lived in a state of perpetual dread that made resistance psychologically difficult. My turn came 3 days after my capture. They paired me with a young guardsman from the 23rd Valhallan, a boy who couldn't have been more than 18 years old and was clearly terrified by everything he had experienced since being taken. The weapons they gave us were crude but effective, lengths of pipe with sharpened ends that could inflict serious injury without being immediately lethal. Private Maxon, according to the dog tags that still hung around his neck. He had enlisted less than a year ago, probably driven by patriotic fervor and dreams of glorious service to the Emperor. Now he stood across from me in an alien fighting pit, holding an improvised spear with hands that shook so badly he could barely maintain his grip on the weapon. I tried to communicate with the boy, to arrange some form of mutual cooperation that might minimize the damage we inflicted on each other. But the Orks were too experienced with human psychology to allow such coordination. They had learned to recognize signs of collaboration and would escalate the consequences until genuine combat was the only option for survival. The rules were simple and absolute. Fight until one combatant could no longer continue, with the Orks serving as judges of when that condition had been met. Attempts to stage the combat or deliberately lose would result in immediate execution of both participants. Refusal to fight would trigger the selection of additional prisoners for a mass combat that would continue until only one survivor remained. The fight lasted 20 minutes. 20 minutes during which I was forced to hurt another Imperial soldier for the amusement of Xenos scum who treated human suffering as casual entertainment. The boy fought bravely, but he lacked the experience and training that might have allowed him to hold his own against a seasoned officer. His attacks were telegraphed, his defenses inadequate, his stamina insufficient for prolonged combat. I tried to end it quickly, to minimize his suffering by delivering decisive strikes that would render him unconscious without causing permanent damage. But the Orks wanted a show, not an execution, and they would restart the combat if it ended too quickly or with insufficient violence. They had specific expectations about the level of brutality required to satisfy their entertainment needs. When it finally ended, Private Maxon was unconscious and bleeding from multiple wounds, while I stood over him, breathing heavily and trying not to think about what I had been forced to become. The boy lived. The Orks' crude medical treatment would ensure his survival for future entertainment. But something had died in both of us during those 20 minutes of forced combat. The Orks loved it. They cheered and stamped their feet and demanded encores, already planning the next matches that would pit prisoners against each other in combinations designed to maximize both violence and entertainment value. I had provided them with exactly the kind of spectacle they craved, proving that humans could be broken down into savage competitors given sufficient motivation. But the gladiatorial combats were only one form of amusement. The Orks had developed dozens of ways to extract entertainment from their human captives, each one designed to explore different aspects of our psychological and physical limitations. Their creativity in devising new forms of suffering was matched only by their enthusiasm for implementing them. Some prisoners were used as test subjects for experimental weapons, forced to endure the effects of crude firearms and improvised explosives, while their captors took notes about effectiveness and lethality. The testing was scientific in its thoroughness, if not in its methodology, as mech boys sought to understand the optimal parameters for anti-human weaponry. Others were assigned to assist with vehicle maintenance, working on machines that were as likely to explode as to function properly, providing both labor and potential comedy when things went wrong. The Orks found mechanical failures involving human workers particularly amusing, especially when the failures resulted in injury or death that could have been easily prevented with proper safety protocols. The most disturbing use was as practice targets for young Orks learning combat techniques. These sessions weren't intended to kill the humans involved, but rather to provide live subjects for training exercises that tested everything from marksmanship to hand-to-hand combat. The prisoners were kept alive through crude medical treatment that healed just enough damage to allow repeated use. I was assigned to vehicle maintenance after my performance in the fighting pit proved entertaining enough to earn me slightly better treatment. The Orks seemed to respect combat prowess even in their enemies, and my military experience made me marginally more valuable than civilian prisoners who lacked useful skills. The work was dangerous beyond belief. Ork technology operated according to principles that violated everything I had learned about mechanical engineering, held together by nothing more than crude welds and the mysterious force they called the Wa. Vehicles that should have collapsed under their own weight somehow remained functional. Weapons that should have exploded in the user's hands continued to fire, and aircraft that had no business being able to fly regularly took to the skies. The mech boy who supervised my work team was a creature called Scarjaw, whose body had been extensively modified with mechanical prosthetics that served both functional and decorative purposes. His left arm had been replaced with a complex assembly of tools and manipulator claws, while his right eye had been augmented with multiple optical sensors that could examine mechanical problems from several different perspectives simultaneously. Scarjaw was surprisingly intelligent, capable of understanding complex technical concepts despite his crude appearance and violent culture. He treated his human workers as useful tools rather than hated enemies, showing the same casual indifference toward our humanity that he might display toward any piece of equipment. This attitude was somehow more demoralizing than outright hostility would have been. The projects we worked on ranged from simple maintenance tasks to complex modifications that improved the performance of captured Imperial vehicles. The Orks had an intuitive understanding of mechanical principles that allowed them to enhance human technology in ways that violated established engineering doctrine, but somehow produced better results. I found myself contributing expertise that directly supported the enemy war effort. My knowledge used to make their weapons more effective against Imperial forces. The work was technically within the bounds of the laws of war, maintenance activities rather than weapons development. But such legal distinctions mattered less than the psychological impact of helping my captors in any way. Every task I completed made their war machine slightly more effective. Every problem I solved potentially cost Imperial lives somewhere in the galaxy. The rationalization that cooperation was necessary for survival felt increasingly hollow as the months passed, and my contributions to enemy operations became more significant. But the constant threat of mechanical failure provided its own form of entertainment for our captors. They found it hilarious when humans were injured by exploding engines or malfunctioning weapons, treating such incidents as proof of their own technological superiority. The more dangerous the work became, the more amusing they found it. The psychological pressure was constant and deliberately applied. The Orks understood that breaking human spirit was as important as controlling human bodies. They used techniques that seemed crude, but were actually quite sophisticated in their understanding of how to destroy hope and resistance. Food was provided irregularly and in insufficient quantities, creating constant hunger that made long-term planning impossible. The rations consisted of whatever organic matter the Orks could scavenge, processed into a substance that provided minimal nutrition while tasting absolutely vile. Meals became exercises in survival rather than sustenance, consumed out of desperate necessity rather than any attempt at enjoyment. Sleep was disrupted by random inspections, sudden demands for labor, or simply the ambient noise level that never dropped below what would be considered unbearable in human society. The Orks seemed to require less rest than humans, maintaining their activities around the clock without any consideration for the circadian rhythms of their captives. Privacy was non-existent. Every action was observed, every conversation overheard, every moment of potential rest subject to interruption. The Orks assigned guards to monitor prisoners not out of fear of escape attempts, but because they enjoyed watching human degradation. Our captors found our discomfort amusing, our attempts to maintain dignity entertaining, our gradual breakdown satisfying proof of their superiority. But perhaps the most effective technique was the casual demonstration of their absolute power over our lives. Prisoners would be selected at random for special treatment, sometimes positive, like extra food rations or easier work assignments, sometimes negative, like assignment to particularly dangerous tasks or use as test subjects for weapons experiments. The randomness was the point, ensuring that no prisoner could feel safe or develop strategies for avoiding harsh treatment. Good behavior wasn't rewarded, bad behavior wasn't consistently punished, and survival depended more on luck than on any actions the prisoners could control. This unpredictability created learned helplessness, a psychological condition where people stop trying to influence their circumstances because previous attempts have proven futile. I watched good soldiers break under this pressure, their military discipline crumbling as they realized that their training and experience offered no protection against enemies who operated according to completely alien logic. Men who had faced death without flinching on the battlefield became nervous and submissive when confronted with the unpredictable violence of Ork society. Major Castris lasted longer than most, his decades of military experience providing psychological resources that helped him cope with conditions that broke younger soldiers within weeks. But even he eventually succumbed to the grinding pressure of constant uncertainty and degradation, his rigid military bearing slowly giving way to the cautious submission that characterized long-term prisoners. The breakdown followed a predictable pattern that I came to recognize in prisoner after prisoner. First came denial, the belief that Imperial forces would mount a rescue operation, that this captivity was temporary, that their service record would somehow protect them from the worst treatment. They would speak confidently about extraction plans and relief forces, maintaining hope through sheer force of will. Then came anger, rage at their captors, at their situation, at the apparent abandonment by the Imperium they had served faithfully. This phase was characterized by defiant behavior, unsuccessful escape attempts, and verbal resistance that only brought additional punishment. The anger burned hot but brief, exhausting itself against the implacable indifference of their captors. Bargaining followed anger, attempts to negotiate better treatment through cooperation, offers to provide information or technical assistance in exchange for improved conditions. The Orks were happy to exploit such offers, extracting whatever value they could, while providing nothing meaningful in return. Every bargain was a trap that left the prisoner worse off than before. Depression came when the reality of the situation became undeniable. The rescue wasn't coming. The Imperium had written off Kelos Prime and everyone on it. Their captors viewed them as resources to be exploited rather than enemies to be respected or potential allies to be converted. The war would continue without them, and they would likely die in this alien hell without ever seeing another friendly face. The final stage was acceptance, not the healthy acceptance that allows people to cope with unavoidable hardship, but the kind of broken submission that allowed prisoners to function within a system that treated them as less than human. They stopped resisting, stopped planning escapes, stopped maintaining the military bearing that had once defined their identity. I watched this transformation occur in dozens of good soldiers, and I felt it beginning to affect me as well. The constant stress, the unpredictable violence, the complete absence of hope, all of it worked to erode the psychological foundations that had sustained me through decades of military service. The worst part was the gradual realization that the Orks were not mindless savages, but intelligent creatures with their own complex society and sophisticated understanding of psychology. Their treatment of prisoners was not random cruelty, but calculated policy designed to achieve specific objectives. They wanted us broken, dependent, useful, not dead. Dead humans provided only momentary entertainment. Broken humans could provide amusement for months or years, their degradation serving as ongoing proof of Ork superiority. The systematic destruction of human dignity was not a byproduct of their society, but one of its primary functions, as important to their culture as warfare itself. The Ork social structure was more complex than Imperial intelligence had suggested. Different clans specialized in different aspects of warfare and technology, competing for resources and status while maintaining overall cooperation in pursuit of their Wa. The political dynamics involved constant negotiations, occasional violence, and a rough meritocracy based on combat effectiveness and technical innovation. I began to understand that escape was not just physically difficult, but psychologically irrelevant. Even if a prisoner managed to break free and reach Imperial lines, the person who returned would not be the same as the soldier who had been captured. The experience of Ork captivity left permanent marks on the psyche, wounds that would never fully heal regardless of physical liberation. This understanding was perhaps the cruelest aspect of our situation. We were not just imprisoned, but transformed, changed into something that would never again fit comfortably within Imperial society. The Orks were destroying not just our bodies, but our souls, ensuring that even theoretical rescue would be meaningless for the people we were becoming. The days blended together into an endless cycle of labor, violence, and humiliation. Work assignments that served no apparent purpose beyond keeping prisoners busy and providing opportunities for injury. Random selections for games that tested human endurance in ways that provided entertainment for our captors. Constant demonstrations of our powerlessness disguised as privileges or special treatment. I lost track of time in that hellish environment. Without regular day-night cycles, meaningful work schedules, or access to chronometers, time became an abstract concept rather than a measurable quantity. Days might have been weeks, weeks might have been months. The only constants were the noise, the violence, and the gradual erosion of everything that had once made me human. The work assignments rotated unpredictably, ensuring that prisoners never developed expertise or relationships that might threaten Ork control. One day I might be maintaining vehicle engines, the next repairing weapons, the third assisting with construction projects that seemed designed more to keep us busy than to accomplish any meaningful objective. Each assignment brought its own dangers and humiliations. Vehicle maintenance involved handling unstable fuel systems that could explode without warning, working with toxic chemicals that caused burns and respiratory problems, and operating tools that were as likely to injure the user as to accomplish their intended function. Weapons repair required handling explosive devices while being watched by Orks who found human injuries amusing. The weapons themselves were unreliable by human standards, but somehow effective in Ork hands, operating according to principles that seemed to violate basic physics, but produced the desired results through what their creators called proper thinking. Construction work involved moving massive pieces of equipment without adequate safety measures, working at dangerous heights without proper protection, and handling materials that were toxic to human physiology. The projects seemed to change daily as different Ork factions competed for resources and territorial control within the larger complex. Other prisoners died regularly, some from injuries sustained during their various assignments, others from diseases that flourished in the unsanitary conditions of the camps. The Orks showed no particular concern about such losses. Dead humans were simply replaced by new captures from their ongoing military operations. The medical treatment available to prisoners was minimal and crude, designed to keep us functional rather than comfortable. Serious injuries were treated with whatever materials were available, often resulting in permanent disabilities that made future work assignments even more dangerous. Minor injuries were ignored entirely, left to heal naturally or become infected depending on the individual's immune system. But death was not necessarily the worst fate available. Some prisoners were selected for special projects that required their expertise, but destroyed their humanity in the process. Technical specialists were forced to help maintain Ork equipment, their knowledge used to improve weapons that would be turned against their former comrades. Officers were compelled to provide tactical information, their strategic understanding exploited to make future Ork operations more effective. The interrogations were conducted by Orks, who possessed surprising knowledge of human psychology, using techniques that combined physical intimidation with sophisticated manipulation to extract information that could be used against Imperial forces. The collaboration was never voluntary, but the alternatives made it necessary for survival. Prisoners who refused to cooperate were subjected to increasingly harsh treatment until they either complied or died. Those who did cooperate found themselves trapped in a spiral of compromise that made return to Imperial service psychologically impossible. I was approached for such collaboration after several months in captivity. The mech boy Scarjaw had identified me as someone with military engineering experience and wanted my assistance with a project involving captured Imperial vehicles. The task itself seemed relatively harmless, analyzing the weapon systems on a damaged Lehman Russ battle tank to understand why human gunnery was more accurate than equivalent Ork weapons. But I understood that any cooperation would make me complicit in the enemy war effort. The information I provided would be used to improve Ork weapons, making them more effective against Imperial armor in future engagements. Every technical insight I shared would potentially cost Imperial lives somewhere in the galaxy. The decision tormented me for days. Refusal would certainly result in immediate punishment and possible death. Compliance would keep me alive, but would also make me a traitor to everything I had sworn to defend. There was no honorable choice available, only degrees of compromise with alien captors who had designed the situation specifically to force such moral degradation. I chose cooperation, telling myself that staying alive was more important than maintaining abstract principles that had no relevance to my current situation. The rationalization felt hollow even as I made it, but the alternative seemed to be meaningless martyrdom that would accomplish nothing and save no one. The work I performed was technically within the bounds of the laws of war, maintenance activities rather than weapons development, support functions rather than direct combat assistance. But such legal distinctions mattered less than the psychological impact of helping my captors in any way. Every task I completed made their war machines slightly more effective. Every problem I solved potentially cost Imperial lives somewhere in the galaxy. Scarjaw was fascinated by human weapon design principles, particularly the standardization and quality control that made Imperial equipment more reliable than Ork alternatives. He wanted to understand why human weapons functioned consistently, while Ork weapons required constant adjustment and frequent replacement. The conversations we had during our work sessions revealed the depth of Ork technical knowledge. Despite their crude appearance and violent culture, they possessed sophisticated understanding of mechanical principles that had been developed through generations of practical experience. Their approach to technology was intuitive rather than theoretical, based on what worked rather than what should work according to established doctrine. These discussions forced me to acknowledge that the Orks were not the simple-minded savages portrayed in Imperial propaganda. They were intelligent beings with their own cultural achievements, their own technological innovations, their own complex understanding of the galaxy they inhabited. This recognition made cooperation psychologically easier while making it morally more difficult. Scarjaw treated me as a useful tool rather than a hated enemy, showing the same casual indifference toward my humanity that he might display toward any piece of equipment. His questions were purely technical, focused on mechanical principles rather than strategic intelligence. But even this seemingly innocent cooperation contributed to enemy capabilities that would be used against Imperial forces. Months passed in this routine of forced collaboration and gradual dehumanization. I lost weight, developed stress-related health problems, and began to show the same signs of psychological breakdown that I had observed in other long-term prisoners. The military bearing that had once defined my identity slowly eroded, replaced by the cautious subservience of someone who had learned to survive through submission. The transformation was so gradual that I barely noticed it occurring. One day I realized that I was anticipating my captors' needs, trying to please them through efficient work and cooperative behavior. I had become institutionalized, adapted to prison life in ways that would make freedom difficult to handle if it ever became available. The physical changes were accompanied by psychological alterations that were even more disturbing. I found myself thinking in Ork terms, evaluating problems according to their crude but effective logic, accepting their values as reasonable within the context of their society. The process was subtle but relentless, a form of cultural conversion that occurred without conscious decision or deliberate intent. My dreams began to incorporate Ork imagery and concepts. I would find myself designing weapons according to their aesthetic principles, imagining improvements to their technology using their intuitive approach to engineering. The boundary between my identity and their influence became increasingly blurred as months of exposure took their psychological toll. But the worst realization was that I no longer thought about escape or rescue as realistic possibilities. They had become abstract concepts, fantasies that had no connection to my actual situation. I was focused entirely on immediate survival, on getting through each day without attracting negative attention from my captors. This was exactly what the Orks wanted. Prisoners so completely broken that they no longer required constant supervision. Humans who had been transformed into reliable labor sources that could be trusted to perform assigned tasks without the need for elaborate security measures. I had become the perfect prisoner, useful and compliant, and utterly defeated. The turning point came during my 8th month of captivity, when I was assigned to work on a project that involved upgrading captured Imperial vehicles for use by Ork forces. The work required detailed knowledge of human military technology and tactical doctrine, information that would directly enhance enemy capabilities against Imperial forces. The project leader was a big mech called Gruzkill, whose technical expertise was matched only by his strategic understanding of human military operations. He had been studying captured equipment for years, developing modifications that turned Imperial technology against its creators with devastating effectiveness. The vehicles we worked on included Chimera transports that had been converted into crude but effective assault platforms, Lehman Russ tanks that had been fitted with oversized weapon systems, and Hellhound flame tanks that had been modified to use Ork fuel mixtures that burned hotter and longer than standard Imperial Promethium. Each modification required detailed understanding of the original design principles, knowledge that only someone with military engineering background could provide. My cooperation wasn't just helpful to the enemy, it was essential for the success of projects that would cost Imperial lives in future engagements. But refusal was no longer a realistic option. After 8 months of conditioning, my psychological resistance had been so thoroughly eroded that direct confrontation with my captors was unthinkable. I had been trained to comply, to cooperate, to survive through submission rather than resistance. The work proceeded efficiently, my expertise contributing to modifications that transformed captured Imperial equipment into weapons that would be used against my former comrades. Each technical insight I provided made the enemy more dangerous. Each problem I solved potentially decided the outcome of future battles in favor of the Greenskins. The project took 3 months to complete. resulting in a fleet of modified vehicles that combined Imperial reliability with Ork firepower in ways that violated every principle of proper engineering, but somehow produced effective results. The sight of Imperial vehicles converted to enemy use was psychologically devastating, a visible symbol of how thoroughly I had betrayed everything I had once served. Gruzkill was pleased with the results, praising my cooperation in terms that made the collaboration sound like willing partnership rather than coerced assistance. His satisfaction with my work earned me better treatment and reduced work assignments, privileges that came at the cost of whatever remained of my self-respect. The end came not through rescue or escape, but through the simple progress of the war itself. The Orks were losing interest in Kelos Prime as their attention turned to more promising targets in neighboring systems. The planet had been thoroughly looted, its population reduced to levels that no longer provided adequate entertainment, its strategic value exhausted. The signs of impending departure became obvious over the course of several weeks. Construction projects were abandoned in favor of salvage operations designed to strip anything valuable from the existing infrastructure. Prisoners were sorted into categories based on their potential usefulness for future operations, with most being classified as too specialized for Kelos Prime conditions to warrant transportation to new hunting grounds. Preparations began for departure to new hunting grounds, where fresh enemies and unexploited resources waited to be conquered. The massive space hulks that had brought the invasion force were being readied for departure, their holds filled with plunder and their crews eager for new battles. The departure preparations revealed the true scale of the Ork operation. What I had seen was only a small fraction of a WA that encompassed dozens of star systems, involving millions of greenskins and their supporting infrastructure. Kelos Prime had been nothing more than a minor raid compared to the campaigns they were planning for more valuable targets. But the Orks had no intention of taking their human prisoners along on this next phase of their campaign. We were too specialized for Kelos Prime conditions, too familiar with local circumstances to be useful on worlds with different tactical requirements. Like everything else that had outlived its usefulness, we were to be discarded. The disposal was casual and efficient. Groups of prisoners were marched to remote locations and simply abandoned, left to survive as best they could in the ruins of their former world. No ceremony, no speeches, no acknowledgement of the months or years we had spent in their service. We were simply unwanted equipment being discarded to make room for more useful items. I found myself in a group of 12 survivors dumped in the ruins of what had once been Kelos City's industrial district. The infrastructure that might have supported human life had been thoroughly destroyed. The resources that might have sustained a population had been completely looted. We were free, but it was the freedom of being cast adrift in an empty ocean. The other survivors included Major Castris, whose broken arm had never healed properly and now hung useless at his side. Sergeant Corvus had developed a nervous tic that caused his left eye to twitch constantly, while Corporal Venna spoke to herself in whispers that suggested her sanity had not survived the experience intact. The civilian prisoners were in even worse condition. Corin had developed agoraphobia so severe that he could barely function outside enclosed spaces, while an elderly woman named Hester had apparently lost the ability to speak entirely, communicating only through gestures that the rest of us learned to interpret over time. The psychological adjustment to freedom was almost impossible. After months of having every decision made by others, the requirement to think and plan independently felt overwhelming. After adapting to an environment of constant noise and activity, the silence of the ruined city was deeply disturbing. After learning to survive through submission and cooperation, the need for individual initiative felt foreign and dangerous. Most of the released prisoners wandered aimlessly through the ruins, unable to organize effective efforts at survival or reconstruction. They had been so thoroughly institutionalized that freedom was more traumatic than captivity had been. Several died within days, unable to cope with the transition from structured oppression to unstructured abandonment. The physical challenges were enormous. The Orks had destroyed most of the infrastructure that might have supported human life, leaving behind ruins that provided shelter but no clean water, food sources, or medical supplies. We were forced to scavenge among the debris for anything that might be useful for survival, competing with local wildlife that had adapted to the post-invasion environment. Water became our most pressing concern. The Orks had contaminated most of the natural sources during their industrial operations, leaving pools of toxic sludge that would kill anyone desperate enough to drink from them. We were forced to collect rainwater using improvised containers, hoping that atmospheric precipitation would be clean enough to sustain life. Food was almost impossible to find. The Orks had consumed or destroyed most organic matter during their occupation, while the local ecosystem had been so thoroughly disrupted that few natural food sources remained. We subsisted on whatever edible plants we could identify, supplemented by the occasional small animal that had somehow survived the environmental devastation. Medical care was non-existent. Several of the prisoners had developed serious health problems during their captivity, conditions that would have been treatable with proper medical attention, but which became life-threatening in the harsh conditions of the ruined world. We lost 3 people to treatable infections that became fatal without access to basic medications. I tried to organize the survivors into something resembling a functional unit, drawing on my military experience to establish priorities and assign responsibilities. But the men and women who looked to me for leadership were no longer soldiers in any meaningful sense. They were damaged goods, broken tools that had been discarded when they were no longer useful to their owners. The psychological trauma manifested in different ways for different individuals. Some became hypervigilant, constantly scanning for threats that might not exist. Others became completely passive, unable to make decisions or take action without explicit direction. A few developed what appeared to be Stockholm Syndrome, speaking positively about their former captors and expressing nostalgia for the structure that captivity had provided. My own psychological state was probably worse than I realized at the time. The months of collaboration had left me with crushing guilt that made leadership decisions almost impossible to make. Every choice felt like another betrayal, every order like another form of cooperation with forces hostile to human welfare. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of our situation. We were completely cut off from Imperial civilization, with no way to communicate with the outside galaxy, or even to determine whether the war was still continuing elsewhere. For all we knew, the Imperium itself might have fallen while we were struggling to survive in the ruins of a forgotten world. The rescue ships arrived 6 months later, part of a larger Imperial operation to reclaim worlds that had been written off during the Ork invasion. The fleet was massive, indicating that the Imperium was finally committing serious resources to rolling back the Greenskin advance. But they found fewer than 30 survivors from a planetary population that had once numbered in the millions, human wreckage scattered across the ruins of a civilization. The rescue itself was almost anticlimactic. Imperial Guard forces in full combat gear descended from Valkyrie transports to find a handful of malnourished survivors who barely resembled the soldiers and citizens they had once been. The contrast between their military readiness and our degraded condition was stark, a reminder of how far we had fallen from our former status. The medical evaluation was immediate and comprehensive. Field medics documented our physical condition, while intelligence officers began preliminary assessments of our mental state and potential security risks. They treated us with professional courtesy but obvious wariness, recognizing that prolonged enemy contact might have compromised our reliability as Imperial citizens. The transportation to the fleet's medical facilities was conducted with all the security protocols appropriate for potentially contaminated personnel. We were isolated from the ship's regular crew, confined to medical bays that were as much prison cells as treatment centers. The precautions were understandable, but psychologically devastating for people who had already been through months of imprisonment and abandonment. The debriefing process was extensive and deeply unpleasant. Intelligence officers wanted detailed information about Ork operations, tactical assessments of enemy capabilities, analysis of alien technology and psychology. But they also wanted to evaluate our fitness for continued Imperial service, to determine whether exposure to the enemy had compromised our reliability as soldiers and citizens. Interrogator Valdris of the Ordo Xenos led the evaluation team, her pale features marked by decades of exposure to alien influences that had left their own psychological scars. She approached our case with clinical detachment, viewing us as potentially valuable intelligence assets who might also represent security threats requiring neutralization. The questions were probing and hostile, designed to identify signs of corruption, collaboration, or psychological breakdown that might make us security risks. Every cooperation with our captors was examined for evidence of treason. Every survival decision was evaluated for signs of moral compromise. Every adaptive behavior was scrutinized for proof that we had been permanently damaged by our experience. I told them everything, holding back nothing about my collaboration with Scarjaw, my participation in forced labor, my gradual adaptation to prisoner life. The honesty was tactical rather than moral. I knew they would detect any attempts at deception, and the appearance of concealment would be more damaging than the reality of cooperation. The detailed confession was psychologically devastating but strategically necessary. I described every technical insight I had provided to enemy forces, every piece of equipment I had helped modify, every moment when I had chosen cooperation over resistance. The words felt like acid in my mouth, but they were essential for establishing credibility with interrogators who had heard similar stories from hundreds of other compromised personnel. Interrogator Valdris listened to my account with the patience of someone who had processed countless similar cases, making notes on a data slate while occasionally asking for clarification on technical details or chronological sequences. Her questions revealed deep understanding of Ork psychology and operational methods, knowledge that had probably been derived from debriefing other survivors over the years. The evaluation took weeks. Specialists in alien psychology examined our responses to captivity, while security experts assessed our potential for future reliability. Medical personnel documented the physical damage we had sustained, while psychiatrists mapped the psychological wounds that would affect us for the rest of our lives. Additional survivors were located and processed during this period, each one adding to the intelligence picture while confirming the patterns of abuse and degradation that characterized Ork treatment of prisoners. The stories were remarkably consistent, despite coming from individuals who had been held in different locations and subjected to different types of exploitation. The conclusion was inevitable. We were no longer suitable for active military service or positions requiring security clearance. The experience of Ork captivity had damaged us in ways that could not be fully repaired, leaving us potential security risks regardless of our intentions or loyalties. We would be retired from active duty and assigned to support positions that minimized our access to sensitive information. The decision was delivered with bureaucratic efficiency and complete lack of empathy. We had served faithfully, been captured through no fault of our own, survived an experience that would have broken most people, and we were being punished for that survival by being declared permanently unfit for the roles that had once defined our lives. The retirement ceremony was brief and formal, conducted by officers who had never experienced the kind of prolonged combat that had characterized our service careers. They spoke about sacrifice and duty while processing paperwork that would consign us to obscurity for the rest of our natural lives. But the cruelest irony was that the evaluation was probably correct. The months in Ork captivity had changed us in fundamental ways that made us unsuitable for the absolute loyalty and unquestioning obedience that Imperial service required. We had learned to survive through compromise, cooperation with enemies, and adaptation to circumstances that violated everything we had been taught about duty and honor. I was assigned to a supply depot on Valdris III, a quiet agri-world where my engineering experience could be useful without providing access to sensitive military information. The work was meaningful but limited, managing logistics for garrison forces that would never see serious combat. It felt like exile from the life I had known, a form of punishment disguised as reward for my years of faithful service. The nightmares never stopped. Every night brought dreams of that crude workshop where I had helped maintain enemy equipment, visions of the fighting pit, where I had been forced to hurt fellow Imperial soldiers, memories of the casual violence that had defined every moment of captivity. Sleep became another form of torment, offering no escape from experiences that had scarred my psyche beyond repair. The other survivors struggled with similar psychological wounds. Major Castris developed severe depression that required constant medical supervision, while Sergeant Corvus became an alcoholic whose drinking threatened his ability to function in civilian society. The civilian survivors fared even worse, lacking the military training that provided at least some framework for processing traumatic experiences. We formed an unofficial support network, sharing experiences that no one else could understand, helping each other cope with guilt and shame that had no adequate outlet. But even these relationships were contaminated by our shared knowledge of how far we had fallen from our former ideals. Regular communication revealed the long-term patterns of our psychological damage: survivor's guilt, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, all the predictable consequences of prolonged captivity and abuse. But there were also more subtle effects: difficulty making decisions, problems with authority relationships, inability to trust our own moral judgments. But perhaps the worst legacy of my captivity was the knowledge it had given me about the nature of human adaptability. I had discovered that there were no principles so sacred that they could not be compromised, no loyalties so absolute that they could not be eroded, no identity so strong that it could not be systematically destroyed. The Orks had taught me that humans could be broken down and rebuilt according to alien specifications, that our vaunted individuality and moral strength were illusions that dissolved under sufficient pressure. They had shown me the machinery by which civilized beings could be transformed into whatever their captors needed them to become. This knowledge was a poison that affected every aspect of my subsequent life. I could no longer trust my own moral judgments, knowing how easily they had been compromised when survival was at stake. I could no longer feel confident in my loyalty to the Imperium, knowing how readily I had collaborated with its enemies when cooperation was the price of continued existence. The philosophical implications were staggering. If humans could be so easily broken and rebuilt, what did that say about the nature of individual identity? If moral principles could be systematically eroded through the application of sufficient pressure, what was the value of ethical behavior? If loyalty could be transformed into collaboration through careful manipulation, what was the meaning of service to the Emperor? Years passed in this diminished existence. I performed my assigned duties competently, lived quietly, and tried not to think too deeply about what I had lost during those months of captivity. But the damage was permanent, woven into the fabric of my identity in ways that could never be completely undone. The supply depot on Valdris III was efficient and well-run, providing essential support for the garrison forces that maintained order in the agricultural sector. My work involved managing complex logistics chains that ensured proper distribution of food, equipment, and personnel across multiple installations. The responsibility was significant, even if the security classification was limited. But the work felt mechanical, devoid of the sense of purpose that had once motivated my military service. I was going through the motions of useful activity while feeling disconnected from any meaningful objective. The collaborative skills that had once made me an effective officer had been corrupted by months of cooperation with enemy forces, leaving me unable to engage fully with legitimate authority structures. My colleagues were professional and courteous, but they maintained the subtle distance that Imperial personnel showed toward those whose reliability had been compromised. They respected my technical competence while remaining wary of my judgment, an attitude that was probably justified given my history of cooperation with Xenos forces. Sometimes I wondered if the Orks had planned this outcome, if the casual disposal of prisoners had been calculated to maximize long-term psychological damage. Perhaps they understood that broken soldiers returned to Imperial service would spread demoralization and doubt more effectively than dead heroes would inspire resistance. The possibility that my survival and return had been part of their strategy was almost too horrible to contemplate. It suggested that even my freedom was another form of servitude, that I remained useful to my former captors through the very trauma they had inflicted upon me. The strategic implications were disturbing if the theory was correct. Returning prisoners who had been psychologically compromised could serve as vectors for spreading doubt and demoralization throughout Imperial institutions. Our presence was a constant reminder of human vulnerability, living proof that even dedicated servants of the Emperor could be broken by alien influence. But whether or not the Orks had planned such an outcome, the effect was undeniable. My experience in captivity had left me fundamentally changed, unable to recapture the certainty and dedication that had once defined my service to the Imperium. The knowledge of my own moral flexibility was a wound that would never fully heal. This is what it's like to be captured by Orks in the 41st Millennium. Not quick death in glorious battle, but slow degradation that destroys everything that makes life worth living while preserving just enough consciousness to appreciate the loss. Not martyrdom that inspires others to greater service, but survival that demonstrates how easily human dignity can be stripped away by alien cruelty. We learn that courage has limits, that loyalty can be compromised, that the principles we thought absolute can be eroded by suffering applied with sufficient persistence and intelligence. We discover that we are not the heroes of Imperial propaganda, but fragile beings who can be broken and reshaped by enemies who understand our weaknesses better than we do ourselves. The Emperor protects, we say. But protection failed when we needed it most, leaving us to face enemies whose casual cruelty transformed us into weapons against our own civilization. We returned from captivity as walking examples of human frailty, living proof that even the most dedicated servants of the Imperium could be corrupted by exposure to alien influence. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But sometimes there is something worse than war. survival that leaves you wishing you had died in battle, freedom that reveals how completely you have been enslaved, rescue that comes too late to save anything that mattered about who you used to be. We are the lucky ones, the survivors who live to tell our story. But luck is a curse when survival means carrying the knowledge of how far we fell, how easily we were broken, how completely we betrayed everything we once believed about ourselves. The Orks are gone now, moved on to terrorize other worlds and capture other prisoners who will learn the same lessons we learned. But their real victory was not territorial conquest or resource extraction. It was the knowledge they forced upon us about the nature of human weakness, the education they provided in the malleability of conscience, and the fragility of moral conviction. We are no longer the soldiers we once were, the men we thought we were, the servants of the emperor we believed ourselves to be. We are something else now, survivors of an experience that revealed truths about human nature that are too terrible to acknowledge and too obvious to deny. And in that survival, in that knowledge, in that permanent transformation of our understanding of ourselves and our species, the Orks achieved a victory more complete than any battlefield triumph could ever provide. They didn't just defeat us, they made us into monuments to defeat itself, walking reminders that even the most dedicated servants of humanity can be broken by those who understand the machinery of the human soul.